This is called open braid stitch. It's made on any double knitting board. This one is with worsted weight yarn on a Kiss or an old-fashioned knitting board loom or a Noble knitter and any other similar loom. You can put cables into it, and for this pattern, which is my Spring Shrug pattern available on my website, I did put cables into it. But in this particular video, we're going to discuss casting on, making the stitch, and binding off. Even though we're going to knit and double braid stitch, we cast on just as for ordinary double board stockinette. So starting on peg 1 at the end on one side of the board, zigzag across, wrapping. I'm almost back to the beginning side again, beginning end I should say. There I am. And before we go farther, I'm going to put what is called an anchor cord between the two boards and all the way down around the knitting. This is really the cast on, we're not knitting yet. So it comes out the bottom, and I'm going to tie its ends together. This will give us some control over the fact that the stitches tend to be loose and hard to access at the beginning. I'll just knot these two ends together, and they'll behave like a handle. I can use them to pull down and keep those wraps on the pegs. The next row that will complete the cast on will be worked also with the regular old double board stockinette wrap. So all my wraps should align with those of the previous row. My wraps are completed. This is the last one wrapped, and I'm just going to knit it over and lock the remainder of the row into place. Each peg should have 2 loops, and it appears that all do. So this row, which is really completing the cast on, we simply knit lower over upper, and it will be done. A little tip for you when you're working with straight pegs as I am, it can help to just put your finger between the boards, especially at first when the knitting tends to feel a little looser at the beginning of the project and harder to control. Just running the other finger, the one you're not using to knit with, along as a control can be helpful, as can the fact that we can always pull on this, the cord, and pull things down and keep them in place. All right, cast on complete. I've pulled down on the anchor cord and also used my tool underneath to get rid of the looseness on this row as much as possible. This cast on is not pretty yet. It won't be until we finish, and then we will chain 1 loop through the next. But what we do for our first true row of open braid stitch is start with peg 1 on the back, then 1, 2, 3, 4 on the front, leaving a 3 peg gap at the end. And just as before, we wrap alternate pegs. So this is almost identical to the stockinette wrap once you get started, except you can clearly see the angle it's making, and that begins with an offset at the beginning of the row by starting with peg 1 on the back and peg 4 on the front, counting from the left. It's easy to make a mistake, but just keep your eyes on what you're doing and you'll be fine. And it's also easy to correct a mistake. See, if that happens, because my visibility is a little bit occluded, that's okay. I felt it immediately and saw it shortly thereafter. So we'll go all the way across like this. Now the trickiest part of the whole thing is not very tricky at all. It's the end. It's got two reasons that it's challenging. One is, obviously, we're going to run out of pegs on the front before we run out on the back. Got a little hitchhiker there. So I'm done on the front. I wrap across, and here's where you need to tend to the next concern. If you do not tighten this up pretty snugly, you'll get a sloppy edge along this side of the knitting. I do not recommend wrapping tightly down the whole length. It's not what I'm suggesting at all. Only here to make sure the stitches don't grow at the end. Now we use the empty pegs up in the order they appear. That one's empty, so we wrap, but we're fanning out to this one. It's not empty, but it doesn't have a wrap this round. This one already has a wrap. This one does not, so I'll wrap it. This one doesn't have a wrap, so I'll use it. This one doesn't, so I'll wrap it. At this point, we are back to normal. It's only the ends that are slightly different in their pace. And something similar will happen on the opposite end of the knitting. After this row, it gets much easier because you're able to look down through the layers of wraps and see that your present wraps are mirroring those below. So this is the row to be super duper careful that you get everything just where you want it, because we will be able to imitate this row in future rows to avoid confusion. And it may surprise you to hear that when I get to the original end, I do not have to be so concerned about tightening the yarn, and the reason is, I believe, that my working yarn is there, and when I begin the following row, my hand will just automatically know to tighten it. Again, we have a slightly unusual rhythm of wrapping where these three get wrapped in order without a gap between them, and these are still every other. I always knit over the very last one first because that locks the row in easily. And then I can go along knitting in whatever order is comfortable for me. I want to show you a little quick trick. Many people lift the board and turn it, and that's fine. But on quite a lot of boards, you can also get a good view just flipping it towards you and knitting over in this manner. So I will go and knit all the stitches on both boards over and be back in a minute. My row is knitted over, and this end I've already worked on pulling the looseness out of the stitches. This end it remains, and you can see it would be a little difficult to knit the following row. So we'll use our cord to pull as much as that helps, and then I can always reach in gently with my tool, carefully snagging no individual stitch because that'll pull it out of line, but a group of stitches and pulling them with gentle downward pressure. This is what I meant by it's not going to flow down beautifully because I've got it set up with the fat side of the board. Eventually, when I've got a couple inches knitted, it won't make any difference, so I'll have to be careful right now. It's true all the time, but especially because I have the boards turned. Now, this row and every following one is wrapped just like the previous one. So one on the back, angling over to 4 on the front. And you probably can see, I can see, that these wraps are stacking up with ones below it. Of course, I have ones below going 2 directions. But the new wraps should align for angle with one of those two sets. And it's surprisingly easy to see after you get accustomed to looking at it. So the open braid stitch just continues like this for as long as you need it. And here we are approaching the initial end again, using up the pegs in order, and they make a little bit different pattern than on the whole rest of it. You can see these stitches are slanted less. I knit over the last, and then every one beyond that. Quick reminder, we're at the right hand end. We're going to wrap across between the two boards, pulling this stitch snugger than most of the stitches, and begin using the pegs in order of availability until we're back to the angle that we've been using, which is already now. And here we are approaching the initial end again, using up the pegs in order, and they make a little bit different pattern than on the whole rest of it. You can see these stitches are slanted less. I knit over the last, and then every one beyond that. One little review note about wrapping open braid stitch. Double stockinette starts here, skips a peg, wraps the second peg, skips a peg on the opposing side, wraps a second peg, and alternates pegs all the way across. And that's what I'll do for binding off. Open braid stitch begins the same way, but wraps the fourth peg, not the second, on the first opposing side. Thereafter, it alternates every one. So the wrapping is done in the same manner, but there is an offset. And at the other end, we make up for it. Well, here, let me just wrap across and we'll review that. By filling the pegs as they become available. So the very edge stitches are not identically positioned to those in the middle. This fact makes it more effective to use open braid stitch on wide swaths of fabric rather than narrow ones, because that anomaly at the edges actually doesn't look bad on the edges, but you want a good piece of fabric that's the same. So here I'm getting to the end of a row of open braid wrap. All the zigzags are there at an angle. Across the board, across the board. This is my last peg that's in work. So I wrap it and then go straight across the end. Now, this peg does not have a wrap on it yet. You can see the ones that do. 1, 3, 5, and so on. So I wrap from the first one on the opposing bed to the second one. Now across to the second one because it does not have a wrap. Skip the peg that does have a wrap. So I'll be wrapping the fourth peg. This peg still doesn't have a wrap, so I need to wrap it. Oops. And now we are back to every other peg angling across the boards. The net result is that one edge will look like this and the other like this. You have to look closely to see that it's different. But see the ridging effect of the main fabric? It's muted at the edge because we have to change the way that we wrap. So there's sort of a selvage on it. And that's your last look at the open braid wrap for this video, because we're going to do a final row of normal double board stockinette and then cast off or bind off. Those two mean the same. Across I go. I'm at the other end of the board, and the return trip is a mirror image of the first direction. I've wrapped the end peg straight across, that's this, and heading back. So our yarns are forming a diamond pattern, 2 zigzags overlapped. And I'll go all the way across and knit these over. I'm knitting over my last few of this plain double stockinette row. Now part of this I've already pulled down snugly, but part of it needs it because it's going to be much easier to work with to bind off if we give it a downward tug as I just did. Here's another little tip. I'm going to need to be seaming this edge of the fabric. So I've got to trim my yarn, but I'm going to leave a long enough tail to use for the seam, and that will be one less end that we have to weave in. So there's my yarn tail. Now, starting on the end opposite from the yarn tail is how the bind off progresses. I'm going to bind off with a knitting needle from a knitting machine. Any brand will do and any size will do. This is from a bulky. You may also use a crochet hook, but you'll see why this is easier. And they will only cost between $1 and $2 each from any purveyor that sells machine knitting stuff. So I'm going back and forth between the boards, pick up a stitch, pull it through the previous stitch. Pick up a stitch, pull it through. It will make a little chain stitch along the end. It's okay to lean over and use your fingers to help you if you can't get positioned where the hook just picks it up, and work all the way across like this. And now you see, I'm sure, why it's easier to use the machine knitting needle, because of its slenderness down at the hook. Almost there, in the home stretch now. Chaining one through the other. Two more stitches. 1, 2, and pull through the yarn tail. There we go. And that'll be used for my seam as mentioned. Now I'm going to move the loom aside and show you what this end this creates looks like. Here I've already tugged it to the side. This is a stretchy bind off, and we need it to be because the stitch is so stretchy. Here's what it looks like before I tug it, and now you can see it settling into place. But it will pull back to its original size if you need it to. Now this is the cast on end, and you can see it looks similar, which is part of the goal, but it was originally like this. I've just done part of it so that you can see what are the results and how we get there. We start at the end away from the yarn tail again, and just as we did while pulling stitches off of the loom, we chain one through the next. These at the bottom, because of they're part of the original wrap, they tend to cross each other. And don't let that confuse you. And just try to find out. See, there's some question about which of these is first. But stick with what you see on one side and just take them in order like that. From what's the back side to us over here, it's pretty clear that this is the first stitch and this is the second, because the wrapped crosses, they cross on this side. So just work from one side and don't confuse yourself. What you're looking at here happens sometimes. One of those loops has grown, and don't let that worry you either. pull a little bit harder on the loops next to it and they'll even out. See, no biggie. So all the way across in this same manner. Even if they look a little funny. Did you see this one adjust itself when I tugged this one? This next big one will also end up adjusting when I pull the others to the correct tension. So here we are with all the sloppy looking loops chained together, and it looks neat. And here you can clearly see, since I've left that anchor cord in position, that what we were chaining is all the loops that extended above the cord. Anything that was below the cord and into the knitting, we did not have to do anything with. So I'll pull the yarn tail through the last stitch, and this is easy as pie. If you haven't cut or untied it already, just do so and pull the anchor cord out. And now there's nothing left of it. We just have a nice, neat bind off. The beginning and ending are not absolutely identical, but they're good enough to not upset most of us. Now let's look at how we seam this kind of fabric. Up each edge, there's actually a row of column, really, of chain stitches facing that edge. And I'm going to use a yarn needle. Get rid of all that extra thread. Mine is extra ridiculously large. It will fit, but I normally would use a normally sized one. I think it'll just be easy for you to see, though, if I do this. Now I have two yarn tails. One was short, and one is the long one I left on purpose for seaming. I tied them together to make a neat start. Now, under the bar that's in that first stitch on one side, and the same on the other side. The very beginning can be hard to find your bar, but after that it gets much, much easier. And we're going to go up the fabric doing that row by row, and it makes a nearly invisible seam. Here I have an oversized stitch. So we're going to stop for a moment, and I'll show you how to adjust that. That's where the excess is. Sometimes you have to feel around to find it. I'm going to pull down here. Where does it go next? There. There. I'm following its path and dividing up the excess as I move. How did this happen? Could have been that I pulled too hard, but I think that what I had happen is very, very common in this kind of knitting. I snagged it on something, probably the loom. There we go. Sometimes you have to tease around and find where it goes next. Now, if I got good and sick of it, I could now bury these excesses by just pulling them in. And I might, but I may come back and really find the rest of the path and evenly divide it up. However, it's out of our way now, so let's go on with our seam. Make sure you stay at the edge of the fabric. We've been under this bar, so it's time to go under this one. We've been down here, so it's time to go here. And these bars occur, see if I can describe it. If you think of this as a teardrop, sort of an upside down teardrop, or a V, they occur at the point of the V or the bottom of the teardrop. Let's see how we're doing. Okay, looks pretty good. I'm going to run my seam for about 8 inches, continuing as I am, and then I'll come back and show it to you. Always use a fresh bar and never skip a bar. And here we go. I know the seam is extending from where my yarn still is, right about down there, but it's pretty hard to see if done neatly. One of the secrets is how tightly you pull your yarn. It should be so it's the exact same tension as the fabric. It's not shortening it up, and it's not causing it to ruffle outward or allowing it to sag. And because this is an armhole, I'm going to reinforce the top of the seam a little bit. It might not be quite as invisible as it otherwise would. There I am. I'm going around the same 2 bars again. But the thing is, you know how an armhole is. It's unavoidably under a little bit of stress. So I'm going to go back down on the inside to get away from the opening. Then I'm going to knot the yarn around a stitch. And you know what it is you're seaming together. If it's say a blanket, the edges won't get pulled on like the edge of a sleeve would. And you may choose to go for most invisible and not put a knot where my fingertip is tapping where I did. Now I've woven in to the inside, snip, and we're done. Now here's the seamed area all finished.